Live from the Short Track News office in Blue Island, Illinois, you're listening to the Short Track News Radio Network with your host, Steve Bechtel. This is the home of the Raceway Park history, Midwest short track memories, and Grundy County Speedway podcasts. Strap yourself in and get those belts tight, because for the next hour, we're talking racing.
Well, hey, race fans, welcome back to another episode here on Short Track News Radio. Tonight, a Raceway Park History podcast. You're not imagining things. Yes, 2 weeks in a row, we have a show. We did a show last week with Tim Z from the Mid-American Racing Series, talking about his series and stuff with Grundy County Speedway, etc. But as we've always said, we're going to mix these shows up a little bit, talking about local racing, talking about NASCAR stuff, talking about taking a look back to my track where I grew up, my favorite racetrack, Raceway Park. And we did a couple shows a while back with Tony Baranek, and he was gracious enough to come back on. We've been talking about doing this probably the last third of this racing season, and now that the time has allowed us to be here, we're going to do one. So, Tony, thanks for stopping by tonight, buddy.
It is an absolute pleasure. It's been a while since we've done one of these, and I'm excited. I'm excited to talk about today and 40 years ago as well.
Yeah, like I said, we're going to do a lot of, our goal is to kind of stick with this, and we've tried in the past, and stuff always seems to pop up, but we're, looking to stick with this throughout the winter time. And, 1 week we might be talking about what's going on, at Grundy County Speedway, where I work at, and Tony writes for us every week, and we might be talking about NASCAR, as their season just ended last week, and we're going to be doing a lot of looking back at our, I can't speak for Tony, but my favorite racetrack. I know Tony's been to a lot of them over his years, but Raceway Park in Blue Island is where I grew up at, and like I said, just love the place and love talking stories about it, history, and that's something that me and Tony, when we get together, a lot of times we bring up Raceway Park and talk about stuff, and we've done some season reviews in the past, and we've done some other hodgepodge of topics. And tonight, we were talking a little bit earlier, and we're like, Tony, what do you want to, talk about? And we were like, well, we had a couple different things we could talk about, and we kind of said, what about the changing of the guard, kind of like over the years, how things were in the 70s, how they changed from the glory years of the 60s, as so many people called it, and even throughout the 70s, it changed a couple times. Seems like it changed again in the early 80s, and then obviously the mid 80s with the Rockford rules type late model cars that came on board. So it kind of seemed like every 5 years or so, Raceway was trying to reinvent themselves a little bit, and some of it out of need and necessity, some of it just trying some different things. Tony, I wasn't there obviously in the early 70s. Everybody says, Raceway Park, the glory years were the 50s and the 60s. I know you didn't start going until probably about the 70s. Is that right? Early 70s you started going?
It would have been 73 was my first season that I was there all summer. It's kind of odd that I knew a lot about Raceway before I ever went to Raceway, because I had a much older brother that would go out there in the early 60s. And I was 5, 6 years old, 7 years old. He'd bring home the newspapers, and I would see pictures of Raceway Park, and sometimes I thought the paper was upside down, because most of the time they were flipped and the cars were upside down. And I just got fascinated with it, and I knew most of the names of the drivers before I went there on a regular basis. So that you talk about the shift every 5, 6, 7 years. I think it would be interesting to take the average age of the drivers from the late 60s through 1976, pair them to the average age of the drivers from 77 to 82, I think there would be a large difference. Much older in the earlier years, much younger in those later years.
Yeah, totally agree with that. It seemed like a lot of people that were racing in the 60s, early 70s were guys that have been out there for 10, 15, 20 years, where in the 70s it seemed like more and more of these, the newer drivers were kind of popping up that really maybe hadn't, started off in the lower divisions and just, decided they were going to run late model, or guys that just, like I said, started at, I guess it became a little bit more acceptable later on to, to have, younger people racing. In the 60s, you couldn't have a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old racing out there with all those veterans. I don't know how well he would have lasted, but yeah, no, that would be an interesting thing to kind of figure out. So Tony, early 70s, you're out there, and that was kind of, when it's happening, you don't really realize it, but that was kind of, slowly turning towards, maybe I don't want to say the end, but it seemed like a lot of the drivers that had success in the 60s now, it seemed like you had all the different car combinations, and as the 70s wore on, it seemed like everybody was in the same, type of car. We always talk about the store-bought cars, how they came into racing, but even from the 60s, the late 60s, it seemed like there was a promoter change with Perry Luster in there in the late 60s, and then 70s, Pete Jenin is back in there, and obviously if you're a longtime fan of Raceway, Bob Pronger, that name was so synonymous, being out there battling, winning features, winning championships. By about 73, obviously he was not in the racing scene, and you kind of had your same handful of people that were winning a lot of the races. Bud Kaler, the grand old man of Raceway Park, was still very, very competitive. But then fast forward to maybe 76, 77, it was obvious to start seeing the changing of the guard a little bit in the late model division.
Yeah, it wasn't a slow change. I mean, let's face it, in 1977, I mean, if there was a young stallion that was racing in those days before that, it might have been Larry Middleton, who actually was a track champion in 77 and 78, but he didn't have kids, like Bobby Dotter and Teddy Moore. And then there were a few others that weren't quite as successful, but it was unheard of for Bobby Dotter, and I'm not sure how old he was. He was like 18, right? 17?
No, he was actually 16 when he first started. Yeah.
Okay, 16. You get a 16-year-old kid going and kicking butt on Bud Kaler, Paul Bauer, Jerry Kemperman, Ted Janicek, Ray Young. I mean, he was not taking prisoners. You had mentioned earlier when we had a conversation that he didn't start that 77 season until June. And had he been there in April, I'm not quite sure that Larry Middleton would have been the track champion.
Yeah, kind of crazy to think about that, because there's a couple different scenarios from 1977. If you were there, obviously it's a different tale versus, looking at a program 5 years down the road and looking at the final point standings. You look at it and you see, wow, Larry Middleton had a great year, and Jerry Kemperman had a great year, and Bobby Dotter had a great year. But it was kind of like they kind of showed up in segments. Kemperman, other than Junior Hanley showing up on opening day and winning the 100-lapper, Kemperman kind of had his own way out there for about, the first month, maybe a little bit longer, and picked up, I want to say close to 10 feature wins early in the season. He ended up with, I believe, 11 or 12, but, a couple of those were picked up later in the year. But he seemed like he was well on his way to winning a championship, and then some, never fully got the story on what happened. I think it was something to do with maybe the membership that the drivers were part of, and racing at other tracks, and then having to come back to Raceway, and Pete kind of wasn't a fan of that, and Kemperman, decided to walk away. He was the point leader, had I would imagine, a pretty decent point lead at that time, and he walked away. And then Middleton, kind of the point lead, no slouch on his own. I mean, he won 20 plus features that year, but all of a sudden now he's the point leader, and and looking pretty good. And then you got a guy, Bobby Dotter comes in there, I think on a Wednesday night, he won his first feature race, and, he was still doing, he started the year at Waukegan. He was doing some, some Grundy stuff, some Ileana, and he was just kind of all over the place getting his feet wet. But, yeah, you bring up an interesting point that if he would have started the year off and, if he won 17 features in, 3/4 of a season, what could he have done a full year? So that's definitely fun to think of, Tony, that, there was maybe, 3 potential guys that could have won that championship if you were there to notice it. But, yeah, one of those things you don't notice if you miss that season and just kind of look at an old program or a newspaper clipping,
Yeah, well, that year, I mean, Larry, just looking at the top 6 in points or the top 6 finishes that each driver had that year, Middleton had 58 top 6 finishes and Bobby Dotter had 40. And I guarantee you there weren't many nights when Bobby Dotter was out of the top 6, if any. So, yeah, it could have definitely been different. And, again, as you mentioned, Jerry Kemperman, too, was just a runaway there for a little while, very short while, until he couldn't race anymore because he got into a fight with Pete Jenin.
Yeah. That, like I said, I love the little stories. We'll have to maybe dig in on that to maybe talk to some people that were there and maybe know a little bit better on the circumstances of that. But you talk about 77, things are a little bit different, actually a lot different compared to where they were maybe 4 or 5 years ago. We mentioned the store-bought cars. You get a kid like Bobby Dotter coming in there, a guy, Ted Moore, who a lot of people, had never heard of him up until, when he started racing. From what I gather, I thought he was a car owner at one point. I think he owned a car that Larry Middleton drove, if I'm remembering that story correctly. But he decided,
I think that's true. Yeah.
But he wanted to race, and all of a sudden he was fast, and he was like a guy that kind of came out of nowhere, and I believe he finished second in points that year, was no slouch, himself. I think he won a dozen features, for his rookie year. I mean, he kind of got overshadowed a little bit with what Bobby Dotter did, but Moore was, consistent throughout the year, finished second in points. And like I said, the store-bought car was there, and was it kind of the perfect storm, Tony? I know you talked to some purists from back then, and me and you have even had the conversation sometimes how the store-bought cars kind of, change things there. But was it a perfect storm of some of these older drivers that were just kind of getting towards the end of their career, and they, may have, not been quite as competitive, or they may have been thinking about hanging up the helmet within the next year or two regardless? Was it, obviously the store-bought cars were, more money. And, if you look at stuff like that, one thing I always remember, I mean, you always had the same guys winning, it seemed, that, that Kaler was, always winning races. And even in 77, it was always Middleton and, Dotter and Ted Moore and stuff like that. But there's so many, so many unsung kind of heroes that were out there and putting on some good shows, man. Just, trying to think of some of the names. I know you can add to them, a Pete Delcato, Ray Bamforth, Bill Botkin. I mean, I could go on and on. A lot of those guys were out there, those guys,
Speedy,
all those guys in the first heat, were putting on, a show. And, you look through some old programs, and, there's like 10 of those guys. It's not like there was, 1 or 2 kind of, back markers, as they call it. I mean, there was nights where you'd look at a heat race and there was like 10 guys that were kind of like, man, they were really putting on a show in that heat race. But it seemed like, 78, 79, 80, a lot of those guys, whether it was cost, whether it was they just couldn't keep up with, the technology against those store-bought type cars, but a lot of those names that we mentioned just were no longer, in the sport.
Well, I get what you're saying, but, Stosh Coleman did it. He made the transition, and he did quite well into the 80s. And they're set in their ways. Probably the older guys were set in their ways, the way those cars were. And as inexpensive as those cars were, it related to having more just drivers because they could, get Dick Raven, Don Dato, Bob Kilpatrick, Danny Ottulo, who actually had some good cars. But my point is, those guys were so competitive, even in their own races. It was just fantastic. And the difference time-wise was not as great as it is today. It's crazy. If you don't spend $90,000 to $100,000, you're not going to sniff the front, and you're going to get lapped within 4 laps of a feature. And, a lot of the guys, those back, as I don't like calling them back markers because they're just as important to the show as everybody else, as far as I'm concerned. They don't want to do it. They have to spend too much money to not get laughed at. And in those days, you didn't have to worry about that because, A, they had a complete invert. So Kaler, as fast as he was, and Young as fast as he was, and all of those top guys, we're going to start in the back no matter what. And if you got lucky and there was no yellow flags, a Don Dato could have a chance, or at least to finish in the top 3. And it was a beautiful time, Steve. From 73 to 77 is my favorite era of racing. I wish I had gone there as a young child because I'm sure it was that good in the 60s as well, and into the early 70s, just to see a Bob Pronger race against Bud Kaler. I think I saw him once because I went to Raceway once when I was like 10, and I'm sure Pronger was probably there, but I was terrified because the cars were loud and I wasn't really paying that much attention to what was going on. So I never really got a chance to see Bob Pronger race, and especially against Kaler, which, would have been wonderful.
Yeah. Do you ever sit there and think about that sometimes, Tony? I mean, is there like, a guy maybe from one era versus another era that, you never got to see, or you wish they could have, their careers could have kind of intertwined each other and kind of, seen them almost like a fantasy scenario to where you see 2 guys that really didn't get a chance to race against each other, go toe-to-toe out there?
Well, I could actually name one that isn't a fantasy. I mean, he was driving then. In fact, he was in his prime, or very young, but in his prime when Kaler was in his prime as the older Kaler. I would love to have seen a season-long points battle between Bud Kaler and Larry Schuler. I think that would have been just the kind of racer that Larry is. I think it would have been just a fantastic thing. But we never really got to see that. Larry came out a few times to Raceway Park, but I don't believe he was ever in a points chase.
No, he would come for the big races.
Yeah, but oddly enough, in the 81 season, Larry Schuler was 9th in points. Hilarious looking back at that is, I think he won opening day in 81. Correct. And said in an interview with me, or actually he did it on the track with Wayne Adams. Wayne said, well, when are you going to be back? He goes, I ain't coming back here. It's too hard to race here. Well, he must have been back there at some point enough times to make the top 10 in points. But he really wasn't there on a weekly basis. And by then, Kaler was gone anyway. So I would have liked to, if that's my, well, you got one that you would have liked to have seen?
Man, I guess I want to just chime in real quick on the Larry Schuler thing, though. I remember talking to him, this was probably 5-6 years ago. And I asked him that question, too. I said, Larry, I remember in 1980, you came out at the end of the year. You broke the track record at the Monza 300. You won a 100-lapper. You finish second in the second one. You're leading the third one with 5 to go. Galinsky dumps you, takes you out. You finish second. you come back the next year, opening day, you win the 100-lapper. He, I don't know if you remember this, but he also won the Mason-Dixon Challenge race when Ricky Rudd and Neil Bonnet were there. That was a 75-lapper. And he had a good, I think he had a second-place finish and one of the Arco 75s. And I asked him, I said, you had such success there. I said, how come you didn't make it out there more? Were you just more committed to Grundy and Ileana with sponsors and stuff like that? And he said, no. He goes, I went out there for the long races. He goes, I couldn't figure that place out in 30 laps. He goes, I don't think I would have been very good in a 30 lapper. He goes, I needed 100 laps to be able to, you start in the back, you set quick time and to work your way through the field. And he, kind of gave a tip of the cap to the guys that ran there regularly. But to finish ninth in points, I mean, Raceway used the dollar to point ratio system. So, winning, I remember opening day, he won and, he wasn't back out there again for another, 5-6 weeks. And he was in the top 10 in points forever just because he won so much money on opening day. So,
it's a big race. Sure. Yeah. Well, I think if he needed 100 laps to figure it out, he would have done it in 4 features, and then he would have gotten it every 30 laps. He was just too good of a driver. I would have loved to have seen him out there. I would have liked to have seen Ed Hoffman out there on a regular basis, just to see if he could weave the same magic he did at Grundy and Ileana. We never really got. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I remember he came out there in 83, 84, maybe around that time, and he ran a couple of nights, and I think he picked up a feature, maybe like on a Wednesday night or something. And he did come out. I know I've seen pictures of that, black and gold #1 in Victory Lane at Raceway. But yeah, he was another one that I think a lot of those guys were set in their ways. They just like the bigger track. There was guys that maybe were more accustomed to kind of the bump and run, and then there was the guys that were more of the finesse kind of type thing. Ileana with the half mile, the speed, et cetera, like that.
Yeah, well, sometimes I wonder, Raceway, maybe it's just my prejudice because that's the track I grew up loving, and it was my first love as a racetrack. And, you always think positive things, but, in my mind, Raceway was the class outfit for many, many, many years. And when did that change, that all Grundy and Ileana became the preferred tracks? I can only think it was because of the money, the cars, they had this perception that, if you take your brand new store-bought Wisconsin car out to Raceway Park, there's no way you're going to make 3 nights without crashing it. And that's probably when it started to change. Fortunately, we had a few stalwarts that hung out. Kaler was loyal to Raceway to the end. For the most part, Stosh Coleman was faithful to Raceway till the end. And, I suppose there were a few. James Bond, Danny Collier, he pretty much stayed faithful to Raceway Park too. And it was a good era, a good time.
Yeah. No, like I said, looking back to me, I obviously wasn't there for a lot of it, but between looking back and reading stories and seeing old films and stuff like that, it was kind of like, the old guard was still there against the new guys, and it was just, kind of cool to see those 2 generations kind of mesh to where, you had, 1 year Kaler's winning 30 features, and then all of a sudden now Middleton's winning like 22 features, and then Dave and Bob Weltmeyer came on the scene. We mentioned Kemperman and Dotter, like if they would have ran full seasons, with as many features as they won in 77. That's another scenario that I think of with another guy out there, Frank Kalinsky, because from about 78 to 82 maybe, he ran a bunch of races at Raceway, but just never enough, to be in a point battle. And it's like, I always wondered, like, man, what would that have looked like if Kalinsky didn't, go run Ileana on Saturdays and did some ARCO shows and some ASA stuff, because he'd always, be good for 8, 10, 12 feature wins, but he just wasn't there enough to compete against those guys. So that was, like I said, that was as fun as, 73 to 77 was for you. I think, 77 to 81 was kind of fun for a lot of the fans to see, maybe, up and coming drivers or new faces kind of on the scene. Bert Weidemeyer winning a hobby stock championship, and all of a sudden he's in a late model and he was fast right away. It was always good for a feature winner too, throughout the season. Bob Weltmeyer, Dave Weltmeyer were kind of, the name wasn't new to the scene, but, Dave was there for a while and he left, and then he comes back and brings Bobby with him. And all of a sudden, they went on a 5-year run between the two of them and won 5 championships, amongst themselves. And, that was, fun times. Haiti, we've always talked about 1981 and that, you didn't notice it at the time, but it kind of seemed like that was kind of the next stepping point to where, it went from 73 and then things changed so much in 77. And then from 77 to, maybe 81, 81 was such a competitive year with racing. And, we were talking about this earlier as well, 17 feature winners out there for late models. That's almost unheard of to have, that many, different late model feature. You look at Grundy or you look at Ileana, they didn't even run 17 nights back then. So in order for Raceway to have, that many, different feature winners is kind of insane. But we were, again, that's part of the fun of these episodes. We do them at night, but then we talk about stuff during the day. And, one of the fun things, we were talking about an article that you had written back in 1981. And, the new promoters were in, Ron Malik, Bill Long, and that whole group of guys that came in, the middle of 1980 and were there to the end of the 1981 season. They were talking about, the car count wasn't the greatest, and that, there was more guys at Grundy and Ileana. They weren't really supporting Raceway. They had all these different plans for what they wanted to do in 1982, and man, how different would that maybe have looked if they would have stayed on board and did what they were talking about doing. But they were talking about running maybe 8 super late model races, a season there, and starting like a more of a limited late model type class, a little bit more than what the sportsman division was at the time. But yeah, it's weird to sit there and say there were 17 different feature winners, but yet throughout that whole summer, the promoters were kind of complaining that there wasn't enough cars coming out there and supporting the show.
Well, there's so many funny things that you could talk about today about 1981 in particular. I mean, when we did have our conversation this afternoon, you sent me into my archives, and I was looking at some old columns I did, and I don't even remember writing this, and I don't remember the interview, but obviously I had it. And you mentioned Frank Kalinsky. He, that year, he had told me that he was going to quit Ileana. He'd had some kind of a range war with the officials out there. I didn't go into detail, and he wasn't crazy about the payoff, okay? So he said he had no plans to race at the Cherville, Indiana track at all in 1981. So that opens up Saturday night, which happens to be the night Raceway guarantees, hang on to your seat, $350 to the feature winner. That was going to be big bucks in 1981 for the late model feature winner. Well, he did finish third in points, and So Galinsky, I would say, was probably around more often than not. I mean, it was a crazy season to be sure, because we actually didn't even know that Bobby Weltmeyer was the champion until well after it was over, because everybody thought Dave Weltmeyer, they had a Super Monza Classic, and everybody assumed at the end of it that David had amassed enough points on that day to pass Bobby and grab his third track championship. Then they did a point audit and found, Bobby was not credited correctly here after somebody got DQ'd. We got to bump him up a spot, and this and that and this and that. And Bobby finally wound up as the champion by 40 points. Dave didn't complain. I'll bet you that if the last name of the guy that got the championship wasn't Weltmeyer, he would have. And I don't know, I don't know how it all came down in the office, what they decided. But anyway, crazy year. Do you want to? I mean, I have the final points. Bobby had 11,280. Dave had 11,240. Galinsky was third with 7,700. And, as you mentioned earlier, these points are based on payoff. So the bigger races, there's more money, more points. Pat Eklund was fourth that year. Jerry Kemperman fifth. Believe he might have been driving for Richie Halligan that year, if I'm not mistaken. Leo Menz, Tom Nielsen, Woody Church, and as we mentioned earlier, Larry Schuler, ninth. Wayne Coleman, 10th. That might have been the first year he outpointed his dad.
Yeah, I remember 81. Stosh had a bunch of problems. I know he missed the Arco show. I believe he blew a motor a few weeks prior to that, and I know he was really excited about running the Arco show, and then had problems in 81, and obviously didn't have the year that he wanted. So yeah, cool to look at those points. It shows you though the kind of the discrepancy, and the top two guys are in the 11,000 range, and Galinsky was 7,000. So that tells you, he wasn't there every week obviously, and missed a bunch of nights. But when he was finishing first, second, and third, and he would get more money. And, the one night he was there than some of the other guys, underneath him, in 2 or 3 nights. So that's why, same thing with Schuler, to be able to, when they're paying $350 to win, I mean, you got to win 3 nights in a row just to make the same money that Larry Schuler did on opening day. So, that kind of explains some of the, the stuff there.
Mm-hmm. But, we were talking earlier about that competition. I was stunned when you told me there were 17 different winners. Can you hit me with them? Because I don't have that list. I would like to know 17 drivers.
17 different guys. And like I said, I don't really think there's going to maybe be too many surprises, especially, obviously if you're there. But, Dave Weltmeyer, and I found this to be kind of odd because, well, not odd, but just Raceway ran so many nights. They started, in sometimes April, ran, through September. They ran 2 nights a week, sometimes 3 nights. They did the holidays where, they'd run Monday night for Memorial Day, Labor Day. They were running, twin 50s. So, they ran, a lot of, different nights. And I think this is probably one of the few years where the late model champion didn't even hit double-digit wins. I mean, when you think of all the years, Kaler won 30-plus, and Weltmeyer won that many, Middleton in 77 won 22 of them. Dave Weltmeyer led the pack with 9 wins. His brother Bob was second with 7, followed by Frank Galinsky with 5, Jerry Kemperman with 3, Larry Schuler with 2, Woody Church, and that I still remember that beautiful red number 55 car that he had that year, had 2 of them. And then a whole host of others won 1, including Leo Menz, Bert Wedemeyer, James Bond, Tom Jones, Jim Sauter and Mark Martin at the Arco Show, Tom Nielsen, Billy Kuhn, Pat Eklund, Larry Middleton, and that might be a trivia question for you. I'll give it to you in a second. And Denny James won a feature at the end of the season, but Larry Middleton won a feature at the very end of the year. Do you remember what car he was in or what his car number was, Tony, for that?
Possibly number 3.
Was not number 3. He was in a number 10 car.
3.
Number 10,
Really?
It was like a Burt Weidemeyer car. I got a picture of it. I'll have to send it to you. But he was in, it looked like a Burt Weidemeyer car, M&J Auto Wrecking, number 10 car that John McPartlin was driving for a while, and then Middleton drove it at the end of the year.
That was his number.
Yeah. And he put it in victory lane at the end of the year. But 17 different feature winners, no slouches in there. Cool to see. Like I said, Denny James, that was probably his first career win. Billy Kuhn, that might have been his first career win at Raceway.
That's the one that surprises me the most. And not that he wasn't a good driver, just that, we didn't see much of Billy out there. And he still a cool dude. I saw him this year at Grundy. He was out visiting and hanging, of course, out with the Weltmeyer camp. And over by John Brolick by the tire stand there, and it was fun talking old times with him. And Tom Jones, I don't recall him having a lot of good luck when he came to Raceway. He
wasn't there much, at that point.
But he's one of those. He's another one of those guys I would have loved to have seen run a whole season at Raceway Park. I think he would have been highly entertaining to watch. But you can't have them all, can you, Steve?
No. Hey, Tony, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back.
At the SRC Pro Bowler Shop, we carry all major brands of bowling balls, bags, and accessories, including shoes, cleaners, and tapes. We offer professional ball fitting and custom drilling. We can plug the ball, refinish, and re-drill. We have the equipment to rejuvenate your ball and bring it back to life. SRC is the one-place stop to shop for any of your bowling needs. Give us a call at 708-407-8584 or find us on Facebook under SRC Pro Bowler Shop.
Orland Precision Machine in Frankfort, Illinois is a family-owned full-range CNC machine shop with engineering, machining, and welding capabilities. We are 100% committed to supplying high-quality, competitively priced products to our customers. Whether you're in need of one part or 1,000, customer service and satisfaction are our #1 priorities. We also pride ourselves on our on-time delivery service and offer local delivery. Industries currently serving include crane and heavy equipment, food processing, steel mill, railroad elevator, and water valve systems. For more information, check out our website at orlandprecisionmachine.com.
You're listening to Short Track News Radio. If you're enjoying the show, please consider advertising your business with us. Or fans can make a donation right through the website to help keep things running. For more information, check out shorttracknews.com. And now, back to the show.
Well, back here on the show with Tony Baranek talking Raceway Park history. Tony, talking a lot about 1981 and as memorable as that year was with, the Arco show and Ricky Rudd, Neil Bonnet, 17 different feature winners like we just discussed. At the end of 81, that group of promoters were gone. Pete Jenin back in action in charge in the 1982 season, and it was like right away, it's like almost like flipping a light switch. It just seemed like a lot of guys that had ran out there again were kind of either not really in racing quite as much, or they kind of moved on to other tracks. I don't remember exactly if there was like a difference in the purse, or what maybe Pete did a little bit different in '82. I remember that was kind of the start of, at least in my memory, of the era where all of a sudden we're running late model features with some hobby stock cars in it, just to make the car count. And it just seemed like you still had competition. You still, Dave Weltmeyer, Bob Weltmeyer, Jerry Kemperman, Pat Eklund, Wayne Parra, Bobby Dodder, Frank Kalinske, those guys were still out there competitive, not, there all the week for some of them. But it just seemed like, even that was kind of getting watered down a little bit. A lot of these cars, they were just, these drivers and cars were just going to, go to Ileana and Grundy or Arco for whatever reason. And all of a sudden you get to the 85 and, the track decides they want to make a change and go to the Rockford rules style of cars. Do you, being back there and writing the stories and, from what you remember, is that something that you kind of saw, the writing was on the wall with, kind of the smaller car counts and with the drivers? I remember Bobby Weltmeyer, he won a ton of features, I think, in his second championship, over 30 of them. Pat Eklund just totally dominated in '84, 30 plus feature wins. The last year they actually ran the regular style of late model rules. It was actually a pretty entertaining point battle with Wayne Parra and Jerry Kemperman pretty much coming down to the last race program. But did you kind of see the writing on the wall that maybe this was something that Raceway kind of had to do and maybe change things up like they did?
Yeah, I think it was inevitable. I don't know if you talk to the drivers, and I remember at the time, I don't know how much more Ileana and Grundy were paying, and even from 78 to 85, the expenses for driving late models had increased, and Raceway unfortunately kind of fell to the wayside when it came to these expensive super late models. And Rockford ran into that back in the day. I don't know the ins and outs of what went on in the mind of Hugh Deary and specifically why he wanted to do what he did, but they made the change, and it took a couple of years, and it paid off, and they had good crowds of cars, and people, I guess they developed fandom for new heroes, and it happened at Raceway. I mean, it took a few years, but they had some nice seasons with these economy late models, and a few of those guys. I mean, Mike White came up through that series of seasons, and Jim Johnson, Kevin Reedy. Well, I'm sure you could name a few yourself.
Yeah, Gary Raven, won a few championships. John Brolick,
Mike Pockris. Yeah. I think it was a worthy attempt. I was surprised when Pete decided to give it up and go back to the super late models in the 90s. I forget what year that was. It was the early 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah. They had done that for a while, but yeah, it was, at that point it seemed like they were getting a little bit further away from the Rockford style, and it just seemed like they were getting closer and closer to what, the other, guys were doing. I just remember when they did the first birthday bash, and all of a sudden I was like, I guess maybe never really realized, or paid attention to what their rules were. And I just remember thinking, wow, Dave Weltmeyer's here and Frank Kalinske and, Eddie Hoffman and all these guys, and they're running against our guys, and they're all kind of on equal ground. So it's like, they must have maybe changed the rules a little bit to make these guys, a little bit more competitive. But to the casual fan, I think they just saw, when it started in '86, and, you're looking at some of these cars, that were out there racing, and, you could tell that they were, sportsman cars, or they were old late models from the 70s, and it, took a while, before they kind of, after, 4 or 5 years, maybe all of a sudden it was just like, they started looking like true late models again, and it was kind of like on the same, keel as, what was going on at Grundy and Ileana. You'd see some of those guys show up again and race, and you get a Mike Pockris that came back a couple nights, or a Brian Buick, and you were like, oh yeah, these guys are, kind of competitive now with what they were doing. But man, that, I was just a teenager when that happened, and I remember thinking, this isn't good. I remember 81, and it was, again, the 17 late model feature winners, the hobby stocks. I think that was their shining moment that year with, whenever you can have Hobby Fest on Friday nights and put 60 to 80 cars in the pits, and that's all you ran, was Hobby Fest on Friday nights. I mean, that was such a fun thing to watch. And, it's, it gets thrown around too much in racing. Oh, there's 20 guys that could win a race, but you know what? There's 20 guys that could have won a hobby stock feature back then. It was crazy to see the competition. And, I don't know if this coincides with Pete coming back in 82. Maybe he had a different vision on things. The sportsman division, I was a huge fan of that. They never really had a ton of cars. The first year when Leo Menz won, he won a ton of features, wasn't really competitive. And then Laxton won in that white Camaro in 1980. And, he won a ton of features, wasn't really competitive. But 81 was like the first tight point battle with Outshorn and Laxton and, Dean Bartels, Jim Johnson, Gary Raven. A lot of those other guys were competitive. Mike Tobuck and Roger Vermeeren, a lot of those guys. And it was kind of cool. And I was looking forward to see what was going to come the next year. And all of a sudden, sportsman division is gone. The hobby stocks are split into A and B, which kind of, in my opinion, watered down, what the division was. And of course, you get the growth. You get the guys that were top dogs, the Mike Varners and the Craig Johnson, Paul Yancic, a lot of those guys, Roger Rubino. They just wanted to go and move up, and they either had to go to a late model at Raceway, which most of them couldn't afford, or they had sportsman cars that would go to Grundy and Ileana, and they would put on quite the show out there. But unfortunately, we didn't have a sportsman division, which in turn I think hurt the late model car count, because maybe you get a guy that runs sportsman in 82, 83, and then he wants to move up. We didn't really have that feeder division to help with the late model. So by 85, the cupboard was kind of bare, and then you see what happened in 86. What are some of your earliest memories of 86, Tony? When we get out there, it's Rockford rules. Nobody knows what to expect. The only thing that's pretty much a given is Dave and Bob Weltmeyer and Jerry Kemperman and Wayne Parra and Frank Olinsky are not going to be back. I mean, what was some of your early memories, or what did you think the division was going to look like in the late model ranks back then?
Well, I didn't like the idea. I will say that just because I enjoyed covering these super late model guys. We didn't call them super late models then; they were just late models. But I actually spent a lot of time at Santa Fe Speedway that season for a couple of reasons. In '86, that first year, I had somebody who was taking care of things at Raceway for me, and we were trying to be fair with our coverage, and I was the logical choice to go out to the dirt there that year. But I do remember, I mean, the emergence of Mike White and his was a White number 14, right? Yeah, White, yeah. And Pockris, good Lord. I mean, he couldn't be beat the one year. I don't know if it was the first year. I don't have those points in front of me. If you do, I would certainly love for you to tell me who was there. In 86.
Yeah, no, I don't have the points, but yeah, Pockris, he missed, a few early races on, and by the time he came out there, it took him a little while to get going. But yeah, he was the first Rockford Rules champion in 1986. And here's one you may not know, Tony. If you remember that white number 14 car that Mike White drove in his rookie season, 1986, you know whose car that was previously?
I don't know it in 2024. No, I could have probably told you 20 years ago, but I don't know. Tell me.
That was the car that Jake Outshorn won the Sportsman Championship with in 1981.
Really? Very interesting. Yep. That's very, very interesting. He did Mike went a long way in a short period of time, that's for sure. But you think of some of the guys that came out of it. And actually, Pat Eklund was pretty supportive of that class.
Yeah, he didn't really jump on board with that until I think he kind of hooked up with Wroblewski. I mean, he was there for some of that stuff, but not.
No, he drove
really.
the 80 in '87. He was third in points.
Yeah. Well, no, he like I said, he ran. Yeah, he ran some of that. I don't think he was there much in '86. '86 was such a hodgepodge of guys moving up, guys coming back, guys. I mean, I remember Dennis Ponton moved up to late model.
Right. It gave him a chance to drive a late model. I don't know that he would have done that if the '85 rules were in place.
Yeah.
Dave
Mike Lors.
Lors, another one. Dan Deutsch jumped up from the street stocks or hobby stocks as they were called at the time. Joe Witkowski was coming into his own. Scott Sturkowitz had a chance to drive a late model. Another guy, that. So it was. A lot of good race car drivers came out of that short era of the economy cars at Raceway. I don't look back on it with disgust. I think it was a noble effort, and I think it had its moments. And Pete did what Pete had to do, and things. I give him credit. I give him tons and tons of credit for trying to find ways to not have to close that racetrack. Because he took us 15 years further than he probably needed to. He could have stayed down in Florida and just, lived the easy life down there. But he loved that racetrack. He loved the people that supported him. And
I think '86 was probably, if I had to pick what was maybe the toughest year, maybe to be a fan. Coming from a guy that loved the hobby stocks as much as I did, and having 50, 60 a night, and to what they kind of had, and not taking away from any of the drivers by no means, but it was like '86. I mean, there was only a couple guys that were really capable of winning features in that division. They had the mini stocks, which was a fun experiment that they kind of did there for 4 or 5 years, and all the cars came over from Santa Fe. And like I said, it took a little while. I remember opening day, Danny Weltmeyer won both features. I think they had twin 25s for the late models, and Danny Weltmeyer won both features in a car that was considered a hobby stock car the year before. And I was like, oh boy, this is going to be a long year if this is what this division is going to be. And then one by one, I remember Mike Lors came out with a pretty sharp looking car. Here's one too. I know you'll know the name, but this is a guy that hadn't raced in quite a while, and man, he came out with probably one of the sharpest late models. This is when everybody was running the Camaro body style, and this guy came out with a Monte Carlo, and it was Don Hellwig. And he came back and ran late models in 86, and I just remember little things. I remember Jim Weber showing up from, or I'm sorry, not Jim Weber, Mike Simon, look familiar, but different guys. Mike Simon came down from Lake Geneva, and it was always cool to me when a guy showed up and, you know, like you had no clue who he was. And, you know, usually that meant he was going to be back of the pack. And this is a guy that won some features out there and, you know, beat Mike Pockris when Pockris was unbeatable. And I remember, I don't know if it was 86 or that next year, I remember, you know, O'Leary, you know, came out there in a, you know, a newer style late model, and he finally gave Pockris some competition. And, you know, all of a sudden Jim Johnson was there, and there was just more and more, you know, Ponton got more competitive. It's like it took them a while to get their footing, but once they did, man, they put on some entertaining races.
And I mean, they all mean something to somebody, you know.
Yeah.
All those years, and it's when Raceway Park closed, I think everybody was at peace with it, which you know, obviously missing it, but, you know, the Jenin family left the racing scene with their heads high, and everyone would have given them a high five. And unfortunately, you can't say that about every racetrack that we've had close. And I don't know, there's just something to be said for that. And God bless Raceway Park.
I feel like we got every, you know, last drop of what we could have gotten from, you know, the the location, the car counts, the, you know, just there, you know, the facility with what it had to offer at that point. And, you know, yeah, it could have came back in, you know, 2001, and, you know, but, you know, and, you know, a lot of people know he was taking money, you know, from, you know, his other projects and properties that he had to, you know, to make improvements and upgrades. And, you know, it was harder and harder to have the city sign off on stuff. So it you know, bummed you out, you know, it was, you know, bummed to lose your home track. But yeah, they gave us, you know, they gave us every last ounce of it. I was happy to see, you know, by the early 90s, it kind of seemed like things kind of bounced back. You know, the late models all of a sudden were fairly competitive. You know, when you added John Brolick to the mix with, you know, Kevin Reedy and Gary Raven and, you know, Pat Eklund going, you know, back to back with all those championships, the street stocks. I mean, if you think about what they were in the mid 80s to where they were in the mid 90s, I mean, the street stocks were definitely a highlight of the racing program. You know, semi-pro division, it, you know, again, never really took off car count wise, but man, those, you know, anytime you'd put, you know, Jim Gilbert and Johnny Sinertia and Louis Pastoritz and Bill Nearing and all those guys, they really put on some good shows for, you know, maybe only having 10 cars a night. And then the Enduros were fun, and they, you know, were exciting all the way to the end. So, I mean, again, it was, you know, pretty exciting. And like I said, we'll have a lot more to talk about here on the Raceway Park History Podcast. Less than a minute here. Want to thank Tony for coming on. And again, our wheels are turning. We're already trying to think of some other topics and stuff to where we can talk about Raceway Park and all the history, and try to get some drivers on and stuff like that. And again, we're looking forward to doing these throughout the rest of the winter time. So check us out on you know, shorttracknews.com, and we're going to keep posting, you know, here on the Facebook group, et cetera, et cetera. So again, for Tony Baranek, I'm Steve Bechtel. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you for listening to Short Track News Radio. We'd like to thank our sponsors, our guests, and most importantly, all you racing fans out there that tune in every week. Keep supporting those local racetracks, and we'll see you again next time